Hello and welcome to another video from Kerbin. In this video we're off to Eeloo to do some probing and then returning home. This turned out to be a very long mission, so there's a lot of time warps and fast forwards, but I've tried to include all the relevant stuff. Okay, so here we are on the launch pad with Jebediah taking us through this mission. As you can see, this Goliath ship only just fits onto the width of the launch pad. All the fuel and rockets and solid boosters needed to get this thing into orbit, and away we go. So we initially launch on full thrust, but if we run at full thrust for the whole of the first part of the launch, the first outer rocket fuel tanks will run out before the solid boosters, so we need to manage the thrust on these engines and the fuel consumption. So here we are now, we're just over sort of 200 odd meters per second and just dropping down a few clicks on the throttle, and we are still accelerating nicely and coming up on 5,000 meters already, and pushing 400 meters per second, where we will, whoop, wrong way, there we go, reduce the thrust down to, what's that, 2/3, and reduce the fuel consumption a bit more. And looking at the gauges, yeah, we are a little bit ahead on the liquid fuel at the moment, so we're going to have to back it off a bit more. So the boosters are actually run out of fuel first. As you can see, we've just reduced the throttle down to about half throttle now, so that should prolong the burning of the fuel on the outer tanks until the solid boosters have run out. Of course, you're using cross-feeding to feed the inner tanks, so in actual fact the outer two stacks of fuel tanks are feeding the inner three to keep them fully topped up. So there go the boosters, and there go the boosters, and there go the outer tanks, and there goes the outer tanks. So yeah, that's the first couple of stages done, I suppose. Now we've got rid of the boosters, we can afford to start pitching over. I don't like to pitch over too much while I'm carrying boosters in front, or well, either side of the rocket. If I tried to jettison boosters at this sort of angle, they would just crash into the fuel tanks and it would be a massive disaster. So we're going to pick up the playback speed now and get up to about 100,000 meters or 100 kilometers. There we go. And very quickly set our maneuver node, and as soon as we started setting it, I hit the maneuver node to start the pitch over to the right angle. To aim for the maneuver node, if that makes sense. I'm not sure it does, but well, you can see what I'm trying to do. It was going to take too long for the reaction wheels to pitch over this Goliath spaceship, so I used the main engines and relied on the gimbaling just to give me a little push in the right direction before we fired them up to full speed. And then you can see we've just jettisoned the next pair of fuel tanks, so we're just down to the main central core now. We're trying to get into the orbit. As you can see, we're actually going down in altitude at the moment, because it took a little bit too long to get the into position to fire the engines, so we've just had to sacrifice a bit of altitude there. But now we're just looking for an escape into a different or a higher orbit than Kerbin has around the Sun, as we're heading out to the outer planets. And again, pulling this maneuver, it does require a certain amount of lowering the altitude to pick up speed to make the escape. So we've just come to the end of the next stage and jettison that, and now we're just tickling the main engine to keep us on course, but the main thrust at the moment is being supplied by this batch of extra solid booster rockets that I fitted. Obviously this gives us a bit more of a kick and to save fuel in the main fuel tank for later. So So there we are, just coming up on the last pair of solid boosters. So now the last few meters per second is done on the main engine. There we go. So there we can see we're now escaping Kerbin's influence and now coming under the influence of the sun, and looking for a quick manoeuvre to align the orbital plane with that of Eeloo, because it's not on the same plane as Kerbin. You get this done early, so we don't have to panic and do it later. So now I've got the manoeuvre all set up. I'm just waiting for the reaction wheels to get us lined up on target for the manoeuvre. Takes a little while and goes a bit wobbly in the meantime, so we're just reducing the gimbaling effect of the engine and hopefully try and reduce that a bit more. So once we get the manoeuvre node lined up, we can then afford to time warp up to the manoeuvre. So there we are, just about at the manoeuvre node, and we've got about nearly 1,000 meters per second of delta V, I think they call it, to add on to the spaceship's speed, so we can get the orbital planes aligned. But I think by the time we finish this, I was looking for a half decent view of the spaceship while it's doing it, but there we go, that's finished, but we're a little bit off. Yeah, we need to tweak that just a little bit more, just get it a little bit closer. There we go, so another 125 odd meters per second. Only take a few moments to do the actual manoeuvre, but it takes longer to get it lined up than it does to actually do it. So again, we're just waiting for the rocket to rotate round and get the manoeuvre node lined up. And there we go, we're there and firing the engine. Oh, and it's wandered off course for some reason. It was, yeah, the manoeuvre node was set. Let's just wait for that to come back round again and we can finish that manoeuvre. There we go, last few seconds of that. There we go. And done. So how did that work out? Yep, that's 0. Okay, so now we're ready to try and find an encounter with Eeloo. We're going to try and do it when Eeloo's at its closest approach to the sun, so that we use as little fuel as possible. Obviously a mission like this, fuel will become critical, I'm sure. So as you can see, we've managed to plot one from more or less the opposite side of the sun, so that when we come right round, we do sort of 180 around the sun and open up the orbit, we will have our encounter with Eeloo. And so we're sort of time warped up to the manoeuvre node, and we're already aligned, so we can perform this manoeuvre. This with a 2,400 meters per second increase in speed to get out to Eeloo. And as you can see, we're getting close. Once we get close, we'll stop and kill off the manoeuvre node and just do the last little bit manually, just to make sure we don't overshoot. And once we get that lined up, we can then do some more time warping. So as you see, we're now, well, we're still 180 days away from the encounter, and we're now 3 years 180 days into the mission, so I hope Jebediah packed plenty of snacks and drinks. So as we finish the time warp, we can see we're close to Eeloo. We're just looking at some of the possibilities for a manoeuvre to get into orbit. I've got a tiny bit of fuel left in the current stage. So while it's orientating itself for that manoeuvre, there we go, we can just kettle that off again and just do a short manoeuvre just to use that last bit of fuel, and then we can jettison that and then redo the manoeuvre. There we go, so that's the last of that bit of fuel. Now just checking the jettison's going to go right. Yep, there we go, that stage is now done and dusted, and we're down onto the nuclear engines. And you can see we just plotted another manoeuvre. We've still got to lose, well actually we've got to lose 2,000 odd meters per second to get into orbit. But obviously the whole ship is much lighter and smaller now, and we can do that on the nuclear engines, but they're sort of much less power than the previous engines. So we've got, what's that, a 5 minute something burn. We will be fast forwarding through most of this. I'm not going to make you sit here for 5 minutes waiting for that to happen. But as you see, I've planned quite a wide orbit. First thing is just to get into orbit. We can tidy up a bit more once we've been captured by the sphere of influence of Eeloo. While that manoeuvre is happening, I will just point out that I did set up a ComNet network around Eeloo, but I actually meant to do it around Kerbin, but I was thinking of Eeloo at the time, and I set it up around Eeloo. It turned out to be completely unnecessary, as I managed to communicate with Kerbin fine anyway. So there we are. We can just see we've just managed to get into orbit. Now I'm not going to use any more fuel from this main spaceship to tighten up the orbit, as obviously fuel is going to be an issue. So we reveal the onboard probes. Now these have got enough fuel to get down to Eeloo and land, I hope. So yeah, we had to open up the communications dish so I could remotely control the probe, and then we can plot this manoeuvre to make an close encounter with Eeloo. I'm going to reduce the orbit around Eeloo in stages, doing it bit by bit in progressively smaller orbits, and so we can get the best options for performing a daylight landing. I have got lights on board, so we could do a night landing, but obviously it's nicer to watch in daylight so you can see what's actually going on. And you might have noticed I've actually ended up in a retrograde orbit, but as Eeloo's so small and its gravity is relatively small, it doesn't make too much difference for a small ship like this. So there we go, we've got a fairly close encounter on the sunny side. So we're just dropping the speed down until we start falling towards the surface, as you can see, and we are accelerating slowly. It's not a massive amount of speed we're gaining, but obviously the more speed we gain, the more speed we'll have to lose before we can touch down safely. We've got what's that, about half a tank of fuel left on the oxidizer and the liquid fuel. Plenty of electric charge, good, because we've got the solar panels out. And at this point I think I was distracted by either something on telly or something out the window and wasn't paying attention properly, and all of a sudden there's a panic, we're 350 meters per second and approaching the ground rather quickly, and it's we just got enough to reduce that down. Yeah, actually quite well timed in the end. With about 100 meters to go, we were at a nice steady speed. So here we are, dropping the speed down even further, trying to get sort of the touchdown to below or around 1 meter per second or so. Just slow down a little bit too much. And there we go. You'll notice I closed up the solar panels before we landed, just in case we didn't land very flat or in case they got broken off. So that's that probe done, successfully landed. So we'll have a go with the second probe, or the backup probe. So here we are with the second probe, trying to get this one landed. I've ended up using nearly all of the fuel to get it into a prograde orbit before I tried to land it, and the nav ball is in orbit mode, which is not making sense to me at the moment, and I'm a bit confused until I notice it. Once I change that, then it makes a bit more sense. And we use some fuel to kill off the speed. We've got a whisper of fuel left, there it goes, and now we're just hoping we're not going too fast. What was that, 24 meters per second I think that was, and we just survived the landing. Fortunately we had the solar panels stowed away, so they didn't break off when we landed. I think that small explosion you saw was just one of the landing lights, one of the spotlights that smashed off. For some reason the lights seemed quite explodey. And now we're just looking through some of the science that we've got on board for no particular reason, because we're not in science gathering mode, we're just in the sandbox mode, so it doesn't make any difference to what we're doing, but just curious to see what we've got and what it does. And you see we've been able to redeploy the solar panels to get the batteries topped up, which are at the moment quite low. So we only just had enough electric power to... Oh no, we've been doing the science experiments. I mean, that sort of chews up some of the electric. So with both probes safely landed on Eeloo, it's time to get Jeb back to Kerbin. So I've spent about nearly 2, maybe 3 years time warping to get an encounter with Kerbin that I could do with the amount of fuel I've got left. I had to wait until I was in just the right place and do just the right maneuver, so that when we do it as there, that we've still got enough fuel to actually get into orbit around Kerbin and actually land the pod with Jebediah in it. So as you can see, we're trying to get as close as we can to Kerbin, and just to pick up on the atmosphere so that we can do some aero braking with a heat shield, as we have now got 0 fuel left. So the only way we can slow this down now is with the atmosphere. As you can see, here we go, heading back into the atmosphere after a 7-year 343-day mission. We've just jettisoned the last stage of fuel. Oh, that nearly hit me. The last fuel tank and engine and the solar panels. So here we are, we've just got the pod with the heat shield, and Jeb enjoying the final stages of his trip home. And there we are through the atmosphere. So we are just looking for the ground now. We can jettison the heat shield, we don't need that anymore, but the aerodynamic forces hold it in place until the parachute starts to do its work. So we're at 130 meters per second. I think it was get under 200 meters per second before we deploy the parachute. And as I remembered, the game now has each Kerbin has their own parachute, so I thought I would try that out, and left the pod to descend under its own steam on its own parachute. And there we go, it finally deploys Jeb's parachute at 9,000 meters or so. It's going rather slowly, so we're diving, trying to catch up with the pod. It was somewhat optimistic to think that I might be able to get back in it. I wasn't really planning to. I was just going to follow it down to the sea. So we're sort of circling backwards and forwards, trying to keep an eye on where it is and not go too far. There we go, we can circle around, back round again, losing sight of the pod, trying to work out where it's gone. And where are we? 30 meters from the sea, and the pod splashes down, and so does Jebediah. So a little swim to the pod, might as well board it and wait to be rescued. But just before we get in the pod, we can do a last bit of science for no particular reason other than we can. And there we go, so back into the pod. We can click on the overview button and see inside. There he is, bobbing around in the sea, waiting to be rescued. We can just see how far from home he was. Well, we didn't do too bad. One continent and a fair bit of sea away, but not a million miles. Well, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please click on like and don't forget to subscribe. And check back soon for new videos. But while you're waiting, why don't you check out some of my other videos? Thank you for watching.